us clearly. The room's quite loud on day 3. Excellent. Awesome.
Very excited.
Everyone's very excited. Awesome. Hello everyone who is joining us for stream of day 3. This is the first time I am here on this day after judging to step in and hang out with
the long judging.
The long judging. Nat also was a co-judge with myself and Dave. And Dave's obviously feeling a little bit unwell today, so we've let him settle to some minor tasks around the event, and Nat has so graciously offered to jump in to bring some of her expertise surrounding the painting of textures, particularly fabrics and how you approach them. This has been something that Nat has been renowned for within the Australian painting scene for a long time. Probably heard her mention it a few times. A few times on. I'm spitting all over myself. A few times, over the judging panel. So, yeah, Nat, what is it? You know, what are we looking at today? What figure have you got here for us? Is it something you've been working on? Or?
Yeah, so I've got my mum and over here. It's one of those things where it's such a lovely canvas, and I'm known for getting very, very distracted with lovely open canvases. So you guys will see that I've basically gone through, and the entire focus on the model is largely on display of different textures and patchwork, things like, so especially the fabrics, it worked out quite well. So she's I'd say about 60% done. There's still quite a lot to do. Sort of man-hours wise, sort of working down. She's a really nice one.
Yeah, awesome. Do we have a cup of water for you? Is that the one thing we do need?
That is the one thing we do need.
Alrighty. Storm, could you help us with a cup of water? Is that okay? That's the last thing we need to get.
Please.
It does. Right, well, Storm, who is always so diligent, so diligent in helping everyone all the time. She's just always the one that you call for when you need help. What's got to fill a bit of time? What are we going to talk about?
So this kind of extends on a little bit of what I did at the Buckz and Nat last year. So I did a thing on freehand there, but a lot of it was also the idea that any sort of freehand industry kind of works into the actual material itself. So with materials, there is such a wide range of different surface textures.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mama.
That you can work on, and it's all down to what sort of texture it is, how it's built up, sort of how we can translate the idea of we know what it should be. Now, how does that translate to surface?
Awesome. Our water's arrived, so we're going to bump Nat straight over into the painting pocket. We'll call it, and she's going to get started. You're going to get to see a lovely little figure she's been working on, and at some point we are definitely going to talk about these eyes. So, it's not textures, but I want to talk about these eyes. So, let's have a look here. We've got the model view. Alright, so
Here we go.
here she is.
It's always interesting to see her in person and everyone's different lights as well. But yeah, so this is where she's at the moment. I have I stopped counting because I felt bad hours of time into this hat, singular hat, and part of it is basically trying to demonstrate a whole bunch of different textures and basically trying to paint in sort of 3D effects onto the model with those sort of patchwork textures that aren't actually there. So basically going through and doing every stitch and stressing myself out. But the other one is sort of to contrast all the really sort of the nice smooth textures on the hat. So we've also got all the texture on the jumper here. So a little bit is still quite still a little bit subtle, but it's working up. I'm sort of right at the stage where I'm about to do the final highlights to pick out those sort of textured areas.
So I guess a question I would ask is sort of that you mentioned that the textures take time.
Yes.
Do you believe the textures to be done at their highest? This is something that people just have to accept about textures. Is like to get when we're talking about textures, because there's kind of a few different levels of texture that we see, right? At the early initially, or the beginner level, it's more just about the marking that we make and trying to make some kind of marking to create some visual interest. And then we start to maybe imitate a little bit about what a texture might be, and then finally when we start to get to the highest level, it's...
So I think textures should take time, because there is a little bit of more than that should go into them. I think it's more the planning stage where it really shines though. I am known very strongly for taking quite a long time to paint anything. A lot of that is because I do get distracted with these sorts of things, but I think a large focus on this is that none of these individual textures took a lot of time, but with the nature of patchwork is you're showcasing a whole bunch of different varied ones.
It's like a puzzle.
Yeah, it really, really is. From trying to work out what colours will sit next to each other, to every single stitch kind of needs to be individually placed and then highlighted 3 or 4 times to give that illusion of depth. So when you're tackling something like this, I've probably spent close on 40 hours on the hat.
Right. That's a whopping amount of time. But it's paying off, right?
Yeah, that's it. So you can kind of see here, I've got everything from like a very matte sort of clay pattern here. We have like a rough button that will show up as well. So we've got
satiny areas.
So we've got the purple sort of satiny material there that's catching a lot of that light. We've also got a slightly rougher sort of cotton or canvas here, and then down to something that's more like a bit of a fluffy sort of applique sort of thing here. And I've tried to keep it so that all the different textures are quite disparate from each other when they're next to another one.
So I guess a question that I would immediately fire off is, this could be a place where it could get wild quickly and harmony could be lost very fast. What are you doing to like constantly draw back to you? Is this maybe if we put the figure down and bring over your book that you have, is this where your book might be really helpful in this regard?
So a lot of this,
I'll take this.
Second. Hey, I need that back. So I guess, I've got a couple of notes here, obviously. So there's a set of sort of 4 things to consider with any texture, basically.
I'll just put a little zoom in there. So Nat, basically she's got a very helpful little book that's just got all of her planning in it. And
I've got a bit like a living book. It's,
do you want to give it a bit of a flick through just as an example of like...
So it's everything from feedback to sketching. So like I've got the planning I did for... there we go. So the planning I did for Sealy in there as well. A whole bunch of notes. Notes from Will. There's notes from your classes in there as well. Planning.
All about feelings.
There you go. So
character sheets.
So this is I guess reinforcing what Nat's saying, that like a part of being able to do all of this
and do it effectively
is that it does require a lot of thought and a lot of process. It's not so much a technique that's just like bust it out and get going.
And it didn't go well.
And it didn't go well. Do you want to come and sit with us?
Come on.
Come. I just make sure it stays quiet. So if I start yelling at people.
So with this one specifically, it's not so much the textures that play a role in harmonizing this as it is. A lot of it is basically hello. So going through and colour is one of the things that will unify something like this quite a lot. So despite the fact that I've got a whole bunch of different colours, I've basically got the entire colour wheel represented on one hat. But I have also made sure that any colours that are quite punchy, I've made sure they're desaturated, so that they can be included without really clashing to what's next to it. It's like I've got orange and purple next to each other should basically be fighting, but the key to it is the orange is always going to have to be quite saturated to represent itself, whereas the purple I've taken down to a very sort of soft, violet lilac there.
I'm so fond of this way of painting colour-wise. Like, it really appeals to me visually.
Yeah.
There's a lot of subtlety in miniature painting. Is actually, I personally think, a lot harder than saturated at times. So you're doing it so well.
It's knowing where to go saturated and not. So I can go a little more saturated in the shadows because that will inevitably be. So one of the things I'll end up doing is going through and doing a glaze of some sort of colour back here to make sure all the shadows are unified. So they'll end up being tinted into whatever colour that ends up being. So it'll probably be like a bit of a magenta and violet, I think. But you know, that's something I don't really need to worry too much about. So the back of the hat does have less detail. But that's because it's the back that's still painted, but not to the same degree.
Yeah, I was going to just ask that actually. It's like the balancing of rendering with so many different textures on, pushing the right ones forward and the ones you want to go back. Is that something you struggle with at all, or is it a bit of a wrestling point with the piece? Or?
Keeping focus when I'm doing that, yeah, absolutely. It is one of those things, especially something like this, where you're trying to have to focus on trying to get so many jigsaw pieces all aligned.
Yeah.
It's very easy to lose track of all the other things.
Right. So what are we
actually painting?
What are we actually painting today, focus-wise, for both of us?
Yeah. So with the focus, basically, I figured that this little patch here on the owl. So there we go. So this little part. So this is part of what's playing into the narrative for this model. Is that so working with the whole patchwork? This is your property craft.
Yes.
You have given her a toy to repair over time, and she has sewed it in with them. Can we move the mic closer a little bit? So
is that better there, Tui? How's that?
I know I tend to be a little bit soft spoken, so that doesn't help. I've often heard that my voice is about the right tone to blend into all background noise at once. So yeah, so I might, while waiting on that, I might continue a little bit. So with this owl, it's sort of, I've shaved down a bit of the detail. So you'll notice it is still quite rough, but I can cover that up with paint. I can change the way that the actual sort of the texture looks by controlling where the shadows and highlights are. And so narrative-wise, that links in with this little patch here. So the idea is that, you know, she's taken a little bit of herself, popped it into the owl, little feel-good moment where you'll sort of discover it's a bit of easy.
Storytelling.
Yeah, that's it. What's your narrative?
We love to say, what's your narrative? Choose your narrative.
Okay, so with this, what I'm looking at is, so I'm looking at what material I want it to be. So depending on what material you're painting, that's how you're going to basically attack different things. So I want this heart to draw attention. So what I want to do is stand out, and the easiest way to do that is by comparing a very dull texture next to it with these feathers. So they'll sort of be painted the same finish as here. So they will have highlights, but it won't be quite the dynamic range of the highlights won't be as wide. So by painting that as something like a satin, where you've got quite high highs, quite low lows, that will help bring attention to that.
Awesome. Let's do it.
So when I'm looking at painting something like a satin, reference is always going to be one of your biggest help.
Friends?
Yeah.
Reference is for a friend.
Yeah, reference is your best friend when it comes to painting different textures and making them look like the textures they're meant to be. So it's a heart, so I'm going to be going like a lovely bright dynamic red.
There we go.
So just laying down some initial, I'm looking at, so satin tends to keep quite a lot of its saturation all the way through, until you get to the very highs and the very lows.
Which reflects quite aggressively. Well, the reflections.
So I'm just starting with a very, very bright red, and when that ends up being blended in, it won't be quite as bright. But so going from that, just mixing in a little bit more of a lighter pastel, but I want to keep it still quite saturated.
Yeah.
And the other thing with when you're looking at getting that sort of 3D effect, making sure you kind of imply that there's a bit of a bump at the edge by adding a tiny highlight there is one of the reasons that I can get these to look like this for sculpted.
Awesome. So I guess a question that people might have is palette. You're using a dry palette today.
Normally a wet palette?
Normally a wet palette. You can do both. You know, I think sometimes we get or sometimes maybe not we, but in painting there can be like channels of thought that are forced, and it's like, oh well, this is just the way you do things. I think the number one thing to remember is always there are many ways to do things. It's what works for you. It's also so much of miniature painting is understanding how to dilute paint and how to make paint work for you. And as you get further on in the journey, it's sort of how you wield that skill. So Nat, obviously a very, very, very competent painter, is not feeling any like weirdness about throwing some paint down onto a piece of baking paper and just painting.
With experience comes the ability to make do with what you have.
Exactly.
And so with this one, especially because it's such a small area, I've got such a limited range of colours and very, very little mixing. I'm going to be able to work with it just
So it's actually it's very much like a calculated choice in a way, because we have a wet palette, for example, sitting right here that could be used. It just doesn't need to be in this instance. So it's another example of actively thinking about what you're doing rather than just going through the motions.
So with this one, the other thing I want to do with my cloth is that I want to, obviously it's going to be stitched over the top. So one of the elements of these is these little stitch lines. And when I'm looking at the way I'm going to approach this as the actual texture of that patch is with satin, because it is so shiny, you will see where it's pulling at the stitches. So I actually need to get those basically sort of worked in before I attack anything higher than that.
Such an important thing, right? That you just referenced there, just in a single line, might open up some lines of thought for people. You said pulling at the stitches. So you're thinking about weight and tension.
So especially when you're painting clothing, like painting like freehand patterns on clothing and things, it's one of those things where it can actually be a lot easier to work with when you think about how it's constructed. Basically, you will inevitably have a crafty friend who likes sewing something. Find out how they put things together. So, for example, all clothing, unless it's say knitted, will be made out of different panels. Even then, so something like this shoulder here, this is a joint. These back and front pieces are joined together. They're knitted separately, they come together. So I don't really mind if there's a slight break in the pattern because they are going to be knitted separately and matched up. And so with, for example, Serenity, so from my piece from last year, one of the things that people kind of had a moment of, that's really cool, was the fact that to make the sort of the Harlequin pattern on the sleeves work, I just put a seam line down the centre. Because it was with the fold of the fabric, it was going to be almost impossible to get that to match up perfectly all the way around. But with the seam line, anything is possible.
Absolutely. You get to choose, right? I really enjoy what you said there about, I mentioned about, having a friend or someone who's involved in the thing you're trying to learn about and then actively going and learning about it.
Absolutely.
So much. I mean, it's something we've just never stopped talking about out here is knowledge and practice.
Become a skill sculptor. Collect them, hold them, enjoy them.
Exactly. Skill acquisition, as Benny X. Layton likes to talk about.
So I won't do them all because it's a little bit hard with this brush in particular.
Yeah, this is as always when we do these. It's about it's often more about the explanation as to why, with a little bit of painting going on in the background, rather than a very intense and focused painting session.
Yeah. So when I go and finish this, I will be hunched over, you know, like a shrimp, basically on the bench for a couple of hours.
Going full goblin mode in terrible posture.
Yeah.
We all do.
But yeah, so with this, now that I've got a couple of stitches around the edge, and I'm keeping them intentionally quite large, it's a handicraft project.
Yeah.
So if you're going for something that's a much more a dedicated sort of high-tier garment, where it's like, you know, a nobleman's coat or something, you're not going to see the stitches, but you will see where they're put.
Yes. This has to be feeling like she has made this.
Yeah, does it fit within the context of the scene?
Yeah.
Have a think about what they might be wearing, why they're wearing it, and
how long they've had it.
Yeah, whether it's weathered down, whether or not you know, whether or not the patterns actually fit in with the historical model if you're doing something like that. And so that all kind of ties into what I like to do with telling a story along the piece as well. And so, yeah, basically I'm trying to hard to get it to focus, but I'm just allowing for a highlight along the top of that there.
Just find the button,
And we could get in.
Yeah, beautiful. I love this. Give me one of those. So what I'm doing is I'm just starting to, I'm literally just tapping in on those highlights. Just along that top section where I want that raised to be.
so you're still in somewhat a mapping phase.
Yeah. Absolutely. And a lot of what I do tends to be kind of stippled in and tapped in highlights anyway. Cross-hatching is an amazing technique to pick up when you're doing fabrics and things like that, because the way that you're actually applying the paint benefits the texture. So with this,
Can everyone please keep the noise down?
When we're looking at the jacket, for example, sorry, the jumper rather. A lot of what I've been doing is, rather than trying to force myself to paint in tiny stitches, I've been changing the angle that I approach it and just using the tip of the brush to tap in those edges. Because that way I'm making the paint and the angle of the model work with me. And the randomness of those little stipple points from the brush actually works to emphasize the knit texture.
You're not going to hear too much from me. Maybe last year I was doing a lot more talking, but that's because I am carefully listening, because I think this is awesome and I'm learning so much. So I'm like everyone back home at this point. While you're doing that, do we want to do a quick rotation just on the hat, because we're in close now, so we can really appreciate some of the elements that you were talking about earlier. I'm just so in love with this. What about, like, how are you guys feeling at home? Yeah, Andy not speaking, right? I am speechless at Nat's painting. Have a look at that. That's just fantastic. And we can really just see all of these different sort of well thought and well conceived concepts. It's awesome. It's fantastic.
So actually I can go into a little bit about like the different fabrics that I would end up emulating these as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. I mean, let's. Do you want to stay? Do you want to focus any more on the heart there, or is there some other stuff you want to talk about?
Oh look,
bounce around.
Whatever's going to be most useful.
Yeah, sweet. Shall I?
I know this trick. To see the footsteps. So what I'm looking at is, this is all going to be quite rough. So when like something like this that's patchwork together, what I was looking at is it's not meant to be a very, very nicely put together piece. It is literally like bit by bit they've found the scrap of fabric and added it in. So you're not going to have even texture on it. It is going to be like this satin isn't going to be cut perfect. It's going to be pulling at the edges. And as the hat slouches as well, it moves around. So looking at the satin. So satin is a very thin fabric, so its folds will be quite sharp. So I'm not going to do big, soft, sort of rolling highlights with this. Instead, it's going to be some very, very sharp highlights and going to be pulling from those stitches. So with this one here, like a big kind of fluffy, like almost tufted fabric, there are pretty much no really, really sharp highlights. Instead, I've got, because the fabric itself is going to be quite thick, it's going to have a lot of presence. I've got a harsh shadow there where it's kind of pulling in and the weight's pulling it down. But everything else, the highlights are fairly soft.
It's very hard to have a look. You've got to have a look. Isn't the quality on that camera?
The camera is fantastic. I need me one of those. I don't want to ask how much it costs, but I need one of those. So with the owl, so the stitching on the owl is very much the same. It's basically looking at, so this is going to be quite a larger thread. It needs to be exaggerated anyway, so go with that. It's a thematic choice as well as a presentation choice. And basically going through with the owl, I did nothing to the actual texture of the owl there. I just avoided painting in additional texture around where I was doing the stitches, and then used that as the main series there.
Does Nat have a history with textile or garment design?
So I don't personally. I've sort of dabbled in it. I've done some sewing. I'm not very good at it, but that's because I spend my time doing it. And I accept that. I'm okay with that. However, I have an incredibly talented brother who does a lot of sewing and knitwork and stuff like that. So not only can I just walk in and just steal a little bit of fabric to look at.
This is a peer behind the curtain into again another point, an emphasis on searching the information, and using what you have available to you to put into the thing you like.
But also the benefit is that I was that child who was conscious, the one who was asking, but why? It does this, but why does it do this? And so basically looking at this one. So another important thing with fabric textures is that if you're doing a pattern, because fabric it's a series of threads kind of stitched together in a geometric pattern, it is going to be consistent unless the fabric is under some sort of tension or force or it's being stretched. So with this, even if it does have areas where it's sort of buckling, and that's working with the actual texture that's sculpted in, the actual lines are kept quite straight. That is 100% I'm putting tiny bits of masking tape onto them and tracing around them kind of trick. Because working with the grid is always going to be better than not being able to.
So and that was something that you emphasised in some pieces yesterday. In regards to if you're going to use geometric freehand, it has to be geometric.
That's it. It comes into that whole thing of if you're trying to look at producing a texture on the model, ask yourself why it looks that way, and that's probably going to give you all of the answers as to how you should approach painting. So I've got a couple of repeated patterns. The only other exception I think is this area here, which is quite stretchy, so there's a lot of sort of slouch in that, where it's all pulled in here, but here it's kind of getting a bit drapey and a bit worn out.
Indeed. Well, I believe Tui suggested somewhere on here that this looks very much like reminds me of the Labyrinth piece, Andy, that you were gushing yesterday. I might have been exposed at this point to, I try to keep as much as I can any kind of personal preference I have for painting out of the judging process, but yes, these types of colours very much stimulate my enjoyment of miniature painting. I really, really love them. yeah, they really do it for me. I'm really into them. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's just a matter of, with this again, it's keeping all of the colour palette, the colour palette quite sedate, even if it is quite saturated here, for example. This for me, this is bad. This is going to get painted.
So what a point, right?
Yeah.
If a texture is not working,
it goes.
It goes, right? And this is paint brave, right?
Yeah.
If it's not working, get rid of it.
Yeah. So this is going to get painted over, probably something neutral, because this clashes with this. It's going to effectively knock you out of the motion when you're looking at the piece.
It is quite jarring, isn't it? Yeah.
And so this has to be the informed decision, because if I'm going to make this little patchwork that ends up here, this needs to be red, this needs to be red, and that can't be red.
Yeah. So do you have a colour already in mind that you think you will move to?
It's probably just going to end up being something quite neutral.
Yeah.
So just going into something like almost a beige like this here, so it's a green-based beige. We'll kind of help sandwich that in.
Yeah, it would frame it similar to what you've done on the other side with the green. I mean, is there a way that you could just like potentially use beige to desaturate this sort of magenta rose colour all the way down into more of just a tinted? Yeah,
you definitely could. So what you could look at doing is, again, kind of using textures to your advantage. If this was something like fluffy knit fabric, the highlight is going to be quite diffuse. It will end up having a lot of sort of fluffy little threads and fibres that will catch light.
Yeah.
And you can use that to go through and desaturate that just by nature. It's going to be catching so much diffuse highlight.
Yeah.
I think this is too far.
Yeah. It's unsalvageable, friends. It's going.
Yeah, it's probably just going to end up getting painted over, and that's okay. That is part of the process. I know quite a few years ago now, you asked me if I was a gardener or an architect.
Yeah.
And I'm a gardener with high ambitions. I like to plan things out, but when they don't work, it goes.
You are flexible and fluid.
Yeah. And so something like this, especially when you're in the playing stages, a lot of it is just a case of you have to do it, and if it doesn't work, you have to accept that you might lose.
So much of miniature painting is just you don't get it right the first time, but you try again until you do get it right.
Yeah. I mean, even this jumper went through like 3 or 4 iterations of trying out different patterns and things before I found something that was going to be novel to look at, but not distracting from the rest of it. Because I have to keep in mind that this is going to be an incredibly busy model.
Yes. Which is something you do like to play with, isn't it? You like to challenge the busyness, which I love. And again, I mean, you've heard it a few times, it's been said a few times, but there's so many different ways to succeed in miniature painting. And taking the challenging ones, like I want to do busy, how do I do busy well, is awesome.
And I think, funnily enough, what I've worked out is that it all does come back to contrast in the end. And I know that's a big buzzword, right?
It exists for a reason.
Yeah. But so for something like this, where I do really like playing with a lot of textures and a lot of patterns and things like that really catch your eye. You almost have to commit one way or the other. You can't do it halfway. And so if I'm combining so many different textures and patterns in the model, these parts need to stay very, very plain, because it's going to be the opposite of what normally happens. In that if everything is busy, the parts that are very simple are going to be the ones that catch your eye. And so that's drawing the focus towards the face.
Another form of contrast. There's so many.
So that's about it.
Awesome. All right. Well, we've realistically got about 5 minutes to go. So this is a great chance for you at home to, if you've got a question for us, we can quickly get to. Tui, we agree. We love having these conversations on the stream, and it might be something that we look to do more and more as the Crimson Brush gets larger. We may eventually have to sacrifice some other areas of streaming to bring different parts. We'll look at it all. But are the eyes resculpted, or is that freehand?
So I tried looking at doing them freehand for a bit. I tried little button eyes and basically giving it the illusion some texture, but that is, I basically ended up drilling the eyes out and just completely resculpted them.
Nice. I think it's such a beautiful touch to this piece.
It did lend itself to a slightly horrifying faced owl for a little while. I've got a photo of where only one eye was plugged in and it was nightmare fuel.
Yeah. Is it Eugen? He's like a Scandinavian demigod type.
But yeah, I figured that with this one, the eyes weren't going to sit flush with how bulbous they normally are on the bottom, so you can see it a lot better there.
Something I just wanted to really talk about that I think Nat's captured on the eyes, if we can go back to that, is that it's the way the buttons are actually impressing themselves into the stuffed toy. They just have all of the right movement and weight. Like weight is something that I've been thinking about a lot more in miniature painting myself, and I think it's something everyone needs to think about. Is like
it's very important.
How much we you understand that you can exploit that with painting. You can use it as a tool to tell more of your story. And this is doing such a good job. She's tied those in tight.
The sculpt already lent itself to it quite well.
They were quite.
They're very sunken in and very bulbous at the same time. So it did mean that I had that horrifying moment of, my very first Spiro bust was getting drilled to the face. And that was there's no going back from this.
This is your very first Spiro. Look at that. How's that? I mean, what a cracking job she's doing.
That's awesome. All right. I think that we just had the one question there. That probably works well for us. We're actually going to be coming back very soon anyway, because we're going to have our judges interview screen. So you'll get a little bit more of Nat and Andy. But obviously, as always, from the Crimson Brush to you, and as you're a part of the Crimson Brush as well this year as a judge, always thank you for all the time and effort that you just willingly give to our community. So thanks again. I'm sure everyone at home really appreciates it. I'm sure everyone at home really appreciates your insight into painting, and particularly in painting textures. I can't wait for this one to get finished. They might have to take, if this appears at an event I'm judging, they might have to get me off the judging panel after I've expressed how I feel about this. But really love it, lovely to see, and we'll be back within the next probably 10 to 15 minutes. No worries, guys. Thanks again. Get the owls in the chat. And Nat and I will return shortly with Ben and hopefully DC.